All right. So, are you ready to dive into some really fascinating stuff today?
Always up for a deep dive? What are we exploring today?
So, we got a really interesting request, actually.
Oh,
Yeah, all about how to fight well in relationships.
interesting.
Yeah, we've got two articles here that give all these ground rules for, fair fighting,
Hmm.
and then another one that's specifically for married couples. So,
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
it's like how to apply those rules in the context of marriage.
It's funny when you think about it, right? Like, we always try to avoid conflict,
Yeah.
but these articles are saying that it can actually be a good thing.
Right. Like if you do it the right way.
Exactly. Like, it can actually make your relationship stronger.
Yeah, and one of the articles even mentions that kids who see their parents fighting constructively
Wow.
are more likely to have healthier relationships themselves.
That's a powerful point.
Yeah, it's like a ripple effect.
It really is. Think about it. Those kids are seeing healthy conflict resolution modeled for them from a young age. Yeah, exactly. It's like a blueprint for communication that they can carry with them throughout their lives.
Makes you realize how important it is to get this stuff right.
For sure. So let's unpack some of these fair fighting strategies.
Oh,
Okay.
exactly.
One thing that stood out to me was just how much overlap there was between all three articles.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, things like staying focused on the issue at hand, respecting different perspectives,
Hmm.
choosing the right time to talk, like all that stuff was consistent across the board.
It's interesting how these themes keep popping up, isn't it?
Yeah, it really highlights the core principles of effective communication.
Yeah, it's like building a house. You need a strong foundation.
Right.
And those principles are the foundation for healthy conflict resolution.
And speaking of building something strong, one of the tips that really resonated with me was avoiding saying things you'll regret later.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah. And that came up in the How to Fight Fair in Marriage article,
Okay.
but it also ties into that no stonewalling rule
Mhm.
from one of the other sources. Right. It's like two sides of the same coin.
Totally. And it's not just about biting your tongue in the moment.
Right. It's about recognizing that those destructive patterns, the hurtful words and the silent treatment,
Yeah.
they can really damage the trust in a relationship.
Over time, it can be really hard to rebuild that sense of safety and security once it's been broken.
Absolutely. Trust is fragile.
It really is.
Oh.
So it's about finding that balance between expressing yourself authentically, but also doing it in a way that doesn't cause lasting harm.
Right. Because you have the right to your feelings,
You do.
but you also have a responsibility to communicate them in a way that respects your partner.
Yeah, it's like you're not trying to punish them with your words.
Exactly. You're trying to connect with them, even in the midst of disagreement.
And one of the articles had this great tip: take a break if needed,
Oh, that's a good one.
right? Sometimes you just need to step away from a heated conversation.
Absolutely. It's not about giving up on the conversation,
All right.
but it's about recognizing when your emotions are running high and you need a moment to cool down.
It's like you said, shifting from that reactive mode to a more responsive approach.
Exactly. You need to give yourself a chance to calm down before you can really hear what your partner's saying.
And that can make a huge difference in how the conflict unfolds, right?
Oh, for sure.
Because when you're just reacting from a place of anger or frustration, it's so easy to say things you don't mean.
And escalate the situation unnecessarily.
Totally. So taking a break allows you to interrupt that cycle.
And come back to the conversation with a clearer head and a more open heart.
Okay, so we've talked about avoiding harmful communication patterns, but what about the actual content of our arguments?
Oh, okay, yeah, that's a big one.
One of the sources really emphasized the importance of attacking the problem, not the person.
That's so important, but not always easy to do right.
It's true, especially when you're feeling hurt or frustrated, it can be really tough to separate the person from the problem.
Yeah, because often those things feel intertwined.
Right, so how do you express your needs and feelings without making your partner feel like they're the enemy?
Well, one way is to focus on I statements instead of you statements.
Give me an example.
Okay, so instead of saying you're always late, you can say, I feel stressed and disrespected when you're late because it makes me feel like my time isn't valuable to you.
Oh, I see. So you're owning your experience and expressing your feelings without blaming your partner for them.
Exactly. It's a subtle shift, but it can make a big difference.
It really can. And it reminds me of another tip that came up in a few of the articles about avoiding name calling during an argument.
Oh, yeah, even if it's just a playful nickname.
Right, because sometimes those little digs can sting more than we realize.
Absolutely. And they can really undermine the sense of respect that's so important for healthy communication.
It's like those little jabs, even if they're meant to be funny, they can chip away at the foundation of the relationship over time.
Yeah, it's death by a thousand paper cuts.
So it's about being mindful of the overall tone and intention behind our words and actions, even in the heat of the moment.
And that takes practice.
Right. It does, because sometimes it feels like our emotions just hijack our brains
Mhm.
and we say things we later regret.
That's why it's so important to create a space for open and honest communication in your relationship.
So that you feel safe enough to be vulnerable, even when things get tough.
Exactly. Because when you feel safe and respected, you're more likely to approach disagreements with curiosity and a willingness to understand your partner's perspective.
And that reminds me of another piece of advice that really stood out to me: the importance of avoiding assumptions and seeking feedback from your partner.
Ooh, tell me more about that.
It's like so much conflict comes from those stories we create in our heads without actually checking in with our partner to see if they align with reality.
That's so true. We often jump to conclusions without even realizing it.
And those assumptions can be so destructive.
They really can. They can lead to misunderstandings, resentment, and a whole lot of unnecessary conflict.
It's like we're building walls instead of bridges.
Exactly. So instead of assuming, we need to make a conscious effort to seek clarification.
Ask questions.
Listen actively.
And be open to hearing your partner's perspective, even if it's different from your own.
And sometimes that means pushing past our own defensiveness.
And being willing to see things from a different angle.
It's not always easy, but it's so worth it.
It is, because that vulnerability can be incredibly powerful in fostering empathy and deepening the connection between partners.
So true. It's like instead of trying to protect ourselves, we're choosing to open ourselves up to understanding and connection.
And that's where the magic happens, right?
That's where the real growth happens.
Because when we feel seen and heard, we're more likely to let down our guard and engage in conflict from a place of love and respect.
I love that, framing conflict as an opportunity for love and connection.
Me too. It's such a powerful shift in perspective.
Yeah.
It really is, like you said, it's where the real growth happens.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder what actually causes conflict in the first place, right? Like, what are those underlying issues that tend to spark these disagreements?
That's a great question. And one of the articles actually touches on that a little bit.
Oh.
Yeah, they mention things like control issues, trust issues, unmet needs, all that stuff.
Which makes sense, right? I mean, when our needs aren't being met.
It's natural for conflict to arise.
Totally. It's like that feeling of something being off, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is.
Right. And then suddenly it's World War III over something totally ridiculous.
Like, who does the dishes?
Exactly. Like, it's never really about the dishes, is it?
No, it's always about something deeper.
Those underlying needs that haven't been addressed.
And sometimes those needs might even be unconscious.
Oh, totally. It's like we're reacting from this place of hurt or frustration.
But we don't even know why.
We can't even articulate what's really bothering us.
And that's where self-awareness is so important.
Being able to identify those triggers and patterns,
Exactly. Because if you can figure out what's really going on
you can start to address those needs more directly.
and hopefully prevent some of those unnecessary blow-ups.
Right. It's like being proactive instead of reactive.
I love that proactive communication.
That's so much more effective.
Because instead of waiting for things to boil over,
You can address those concerns before they turn into huge fights.
which means you can avoid a lot of unnecessary stress and drama.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it makes you realize that those recurring patterns of conflict, they can be valuable clues.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like if you're always arguing about the same thing over and over again,
It's probably a sign that there's something deeper going on.
that needs to be addressed.
Exactly like your relationship is trying to tell you something.
So instead of getting stuck in that same old argument,
You can use it as an opportunity for growth,
I love that, framing it as an opportunity.
because it really is a chance to learn and understand each other better.
Okay, so let's get a little bit more practical here.
All right, I'm ready.
One of the articles actually gives 16 specific rules for fighting fair.
16. Wow, that's a lot to remember.
It is. But the good news is a lot of them are interconnected.
Like how?
Well, for example, staying focused on the issue at hand
Okay.
is really similar to avoiding bringing up past hurts.
Yeah, those definitely go hand in hand.
Right. Because they both contribute to keeping the conversation productive.
And preventing things from escalating.
Exactly. So it's not really about memorizing a bunch of rules.
No, it's more about understanding those core principles of respectful communication,
And then being able to apply them in real life.
which takes practice, of course.
For sure. The more you do it, the easier it gets.
Like anything else, it becomes more natural over time.
One strategy that I really liked was the idea of being more intentional about the timing of difficult conversations.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Well, sometimes choosing not to fight in the moment is actually the best thing you can do.
You know, You're totally right. I've definitely been there, like, exhausted after a long day trying to have a serious conversation, and it just ends up being a disaster.
It's like the recipe for a communication breakdown.
Exactly. So instead of just launching into a difficult conversation whenever you feel like it,
You need to be more mindful of the timing
and choose a moment when you're both calm and
and
focused.
actually able to listen to each other.
It's like choosing your battles, but in this case, you're choosing the battlefield.
The right time and place for that conversation,
Exactly. And sometimes that might even mean scheduling a specific time to talk.
which might feel a little formal at first.
I know, but it can actually be really helpful,
It shows that you're both taking it seriously.
and that you're committed to resolving the issue together.
That's such a key point. It's about that shared commitment to finding a solution.
Not just trying to win the argument.
Okay, so we've talked about choosing the right time and setting the right tone, but what about the actual content of our communication?
Right, like what are we actually saying to each other during these disagreements?
One of the articles had this amazing piece of advice: don't make assumptions.
Oh my gosh, that is so important.
Right. But how often do we do that? Like we jump to conclusions about our partner's intentions.
Without even giving them a chance to explain themselves.
All the time.
And it's so easy to do.
It is, but those assumptions can be so destructive.
They really can, because they create misunderstandings, resentment, all sorts of unnecessary drama.
So instead of assuming, we need to be more curious,
Ask questions.
listen actively,
And be open to hearing our partner's perspective,
even if it's totally different from our own.
which can be hard sometimes, right?
It can, especially when we feel like we're right.
And they're wrong.
But that's where that willingness to be vulnerable comes in.
Being open to seeing things from a different angle.
And that vulnerability can be so powerful.
It really can, because it allows us to connect with our partner on a deeper level.
So it's like, instead of protecting ourselves,
We're choosing to open ourselves up to understanding and connection.
which ultimately leads to a stronger and more fulfilling relationship.
Exactly. It's about choosing love over ego.
You know, it's funny. We often think about fighting fair as avoiding negativity.
Right. Like just trying to keep things calm.
But one of the articles actually emphasized the importance of expressing our feelings openly and honestly,
Even the negative ones.
especially the negative ones.
That's interesting. Tell me more.
Well, it's not about just venting your anger or frustration.
Okay.
It's about being able to tap into those more vulnerable emotions like sadness, hurt, fear,
And sharing them with your partner.
in a way that invites connection rather than conflict.
So it's about being vulnerable and authentic.
Exactly. It's about saying, hey, I trust you enough to let you see this part of me, even if it's messy.
That takes a lot of courage.
It does, but it can also be incredibly healing.
Because when we share our true feelings with our partner,
We're creating space for intimacy and deeper understanding,
and that's what it's all about, right?
building that strong foundation of trust and connection.
So that we can weather any storm together.
I love that. Okay, I'm feeling so inspired by all this practical advice.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's so refreshing to hear something different than just don't go to bed angry.
Right. It's about equipping ourselves with the tools and strategies we need to navigate conflict effectively.
And remembering that conflict, when handled constructively,
Can actually strengthen our relationship.
absolutely, it's an opportunity for growth and deeper connection
Yeah, it's like you said, conflict can actually bring you closer together.
if you handle it the right way.
Exactly. And speaking of things to avoid, one of the sources really called out stonewalling as a big no-no in terms of fair fighting.
Yeah, the silent treatment.
It might seem like a way to de-escalate in the moment.
But it can actually make things worse in the long run.
One of the articles even called it a really harsh way of existing in conflict,
And it is right, because it sends the message that you're not even willing to engage.
which can be so hurtful.
Absolutely. It makes your partner feel dismissed and invalidated.
And it creates this distance in the relationship,
Right, because you're shutting down communication completely.
which is the opposite of what you want when you're trying to resolve a conflict.
Exactly. Communication is key.
So what's the alternative? What should you do if you're feeling overwhelmed and you just need a break from the argument?
Well, that's where that advice about taking a break comes in.
You have to do it in a way that's respectful.
Right. So instead of just storming off or giving your partner the silent treatment
You need to let them know that you need a few minutes to calm down,
to collect your thoughts.
so they know that you're not abandoning the conversation altogether,
Exactly. You're just hitting the pause button.
not the eject button.
So you can come back to the conversation when you're in a better headspace
I like that analogy, and sometimes that pause is all you need to shift the energy.
and allow for a more productive conversation.
Totally. So it's about recognizing when you need that space.
And communicating that need to your partner in a healthy way.
You know, it's interesting. We often think about fighting fair as being all about what we say.
The words we use.
But one of the articles also talked about the importance of how we act during an argument.
Oh, yeah, our behavior.
They were really clear about setting boundaries around certain things, like no yelling,
No name calling.
no threats, no cursing,
Those are all really important boundaries.
because those behaviors just escalate the conflict.
And make it impossible to have a productive conversation.
It's like they create this wall of negativity.
That shuts down any possibility of real connection.
So even when you're feeling really angry or frustrated,
You have to try to stay mindful of those boundaries.
and focus on communicating your needs in a way that respects your partner.
And the relationship.
It's about remembering that the goal is to resolve the conflict.
Not to hurt your partner.
Because sometimes in the heat of the moment, we can say or do things that we later regret,
We get so caught up in proving our point that we lose sight of the bigger picture.
which is the health and well-being of the relationship.
Right, you have to remember that you're on the same team.
Even when you're disagreeing. So all this talk about fighting fair is making me think, what's one communication pattern that you've noticed in your own relationships that you might want to work on based on what we've discussed today? What about you? Anything resonating?
That's a great question. It's so easy to focus on other people's communication patterns, right? But it's important to look at our own habits too.
Totally.
I think for me, it's about being more mindful of my tone of voice,
Oh, yeah.
especially when I'm stressed or overwhelmed.
I get that.
Sometimes I can come across as harsh or critical even when I don't mean to.
It happens to the best of us. What about you?
I think for me, it's about being more patient and really giving my partner the space to express themselves fully.
Even when you disagree,
Yeah, because sometimes I can get so caught up in thinking about my response.
that you're not really listening.
Exactly.
Sounds like we both have some work to do.
We do, but that's okay, right?
Oh, absolutely.
It's not about being perfect.
It's about continuous growth and always striving to communicate more effectively with the people we love.
Exactly. And even small changes can make a big difference.
So true.
Uh,
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We've explored the principles of fair fighting, the psychology of conflict.
And we even challenged ourselves to identify some areas for personal growth.
It's been quite a journey.
It really has, and I hope our listeners are feeling inspired to put some of these strategies into practice.
Me too, because at the end of the day, it's not about avoiding conflict altogether.
It's about learning how to navigate those disagreements in a way that strengthens our relationships.
Beautifully said, conflict is a natural part of any relationship.
It is.
The key is learning how to dance with it gracefully.
Turning those moments of friction into opportunities for growth and connection.
I love that analogy.
Me too. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you've learned something new and are feeling empowered to create more loving and fulfilling relationships in your own life.
Until next time.
See you then.